Hey everyone, how's it going? For those of you who were here last year, this is a follow-up to last year's talk that we had and debate that we had. Last year we focused and laid a lot of groundwork on the Snowden disclosures as well as what the NSA and the intelligence community is and is not doing. I'm going to try and run through the intro and overview very quickly so that we can just jump into what we plan to talk about now or for this session, which is the USA Freedom Act, which is an act that Congress passed over the summer to fix one of the many programs that we've learned about. So the intro, I'm Mark Jaycox. I do the legislative affairs for the Electronic Frontier Foundation on the civil liberties and privacy side. I focus on surveillance, user privacy, national security stuff, as well as email privacy law.
I'm Jamil Jaffer. I just recently left the government. I was working at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Before that, I worked at the House Intelligence Committee where I did NSA oversight, worked on cyber intelligence sharing legislation, and prior to that worked in the Justice Department of the White House, also working on surveillance matters and the like. So,
cool. And so what we're going to talk about primarily two things. I think, we will definitely mention some of the newer NSA activities that we learned about, but we will be focusing more so on the USA Freedom Act and what it did it do anything, does Congress ever do anything, and if it was a good or bad law or somewhere in between. So quick overview for those of you who may not know what the USA Freedom Act is or what it does. And so this was a bill that passed Congress over the summer. It deals with the Verizon order that we saw. This was an order where the government was using Section 215 of the Patriot Act to collect Americans' domestic calling records. The order was sent to various telco companies, and then they were mandated to hand over the daily calling records, our daily calling records, Americans' daily calling records. What the bill does is mainly just three things. The first thing it does is it stops that program, right? It mandates that when the government does search or when the government does file an order under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, they have to name what's defined in the bill as a specific selection term. There's some debate as to what can and cannot be a specific selection term, but it introduces this idea that the government can't just say, as they were, all Americans' calling records are relevant to an investigation and we want them. The second thing it does is it introduces an amicus into the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is a surveillance court that was established in 1978 when Congress first passed all these foreign intelligence laws. And what it does is that court operates in D.C. They're rotating judges on it, and they review the orders sent over and filed by the government under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The bill does is it does not mandate, but it strongly encourages the FISA court that they should be including an adversary when an argument is novel, when there's a new use of a technology, when there's a core constitutional issue, and when key terms in the USA Freedom Act are being interpreted in new ways or different ways. The third thing it does is it introduces transparency, right? The FISA court is was infamous for not disclosing orders, for being highly secretive, and for being a rubber stamp. We've seen a lot of the numbers of the orders modified, deleted. It's a very low percentage. That's reflective also sometimes of the FISA court system, where some of the orders do not go, straight to the judge. There are advisors who sometimes look at those orders, but it's mainly been, seen as a rubber stamp. And the third thing the USA Freedom Act does is it introduces transparency requirements, reporting requirements. So the government now has to require the number of orders, the number of customer accounts that may be affected, and the like, as well as not just the USA Freedom Act doesn't just allow for the U.S. government reporting, it also allows companies to report in these wide bands. It's something we fought for, a very narrow band. We would like to see companies report, I've received 21 NSLs, but what the USA Freedom Act does is does it in bands. And NSLs are national security letters, a form of process under the law where the government does get business records and the like. And so what it does is it does these wide bands, so 0 to 100, 0 to 500, every 6 months. And so those are the main three big things that the bill does. And that provides a very quick overview of that. After that, I'm going to just jump into what I think, and then I think Jamil's going to respond. We're right on time, which is nice. And then we'll open it up for questions because I think last year a lot of people. It is rare, I think, to get two very opposite people up on stage together to talk about these things. I mean, sometimes it happens, but it is often not colloquial. It's often not as friendly, I guess I should say. So I think questions, for you guys to ask both of us is really vital. So just jumping into it, the USA Freedom Act, is it good, is it bad? EFF supported the USA Freedom Act up until around when the Second Circuit, ACLU, brought a case against the Section 215 program, the business records program. And we did support the bill up until that point. We thought that the bill, and we still think the bill is a small step, but it's an important step. We've seen internet activists, we've seen, a lot of the pro-privacy actors and civil society organizations kill bad bills, right? We killed SOPO. We have been killing for the past few years the cybersecurity bills, although we'll see on that. We have been killing a lot of these very privacy invasive bills, or bills that we think are very privacy invasive. A big step for, I think, privacy advocates and privacy organizations is passing that bill, right? It showed that you can have a very cohesive, organized, sustained campaign over 2 years, right? Work on that bill and work to reform at least this one program of the NSA started essentially after Ed Snowden released his disclosures. So you had a sustained, coordinated campaign, and you actually got something through Congress. So I think it's a big step for privacy advocates, but you have to look at that, and you have to look at the other side of the coin and say, look, the step is small. Admittedly, it's a small step, but I think it's a step that's going to build. It's going to build, hopefully, for further reform. Another one of these programs, the law that authorizes one of these programs is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendments Act, and that is a welcomed fight in 2017 about what's going to happen to that law. So, I think where we come from is that it is good, that it is a small step, and also that it is very important to have a bill that narrows the power of the intelligence community. This is the first time that's happened since they wrote the original law in 1978, and that's, I think, a good feat. It's a big feat. And mandating that the government has to be specific, right? We won't stand for the government filing very broad blanket orders collecting our information, Americans' information. And so I think the standard that the USA Freedom Act places on the government and mandates a much narrow search and a particular search is really important. The second thing I think is also important are the institutional changes. The FISA court suffers from a lot of problems, right? You had the Washington Post write an article quoting the former FISA court judge saying, look, we can't really regulate this stuff. We rely on the NSA to notify us when something goes wrong, and we try and investigate. So, I think the institutional changes in USA Freedom where the court is going to have an amicus in there, right? This is not just going to be a one-sided court anymore, as well as the opinions will be released. So if the bill works, we should not have a significant opinion like the secret Verizon order or the secret interpretations of Section 215 kept in the closet. The bill says if it's novel, if it's significant, if there's a constitutional issue, it has to be released. And so those are, I think, a very quick overview of, what I think about USA Freedom, what we think about USA Freedom, and the good that's there, but also, looking at the other side of the coin and looking at the marginal and small step that it did make.
Thanks, Mark. So I think there are a few challenges with USA Freedom. I think the biggest one, the most obvious one is, look, we were here last year talking about NSA surveillance, and the week that we were at the conference, the U.S. began attacking ISIS in Iraq and eventually Syria, in part because ISIS presents a national security threat to the United States. They've taken over a significant amount of land. We're now a year later, and the threat from ISIS is growing. If you believe the FBI director, I know a lot of people are very skeptical of the national security structure of our government, but if you believe the FBI director, Jim Comey, he says that ISIS is talking to hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans in the United States about trying to encourage them to become radicalized, encourage them to use encrypted methods of communication to communicate with ISIS and to undertake attacks here in the United States as lone wolves. And so the threat, at least as perceived by the government, as described by the FBI, is growing. And the USA Freedom Act takes one tool, and there's questions about how significant and how valuable a tool it is, but takes one tool off the table at a time when other governments around the world, including in some of our allies in Great Britain and the like, are actually increasing their own domestic surveillance authorities, as well as their ability to, for example, revoke the citizenship of their own citizens who go to fight with ISIS. And so it's an interesting dynamic where in the United States we're taking steps to limit what the government is doing as a result of some of the disclosures that have taken place, while other countries are actually moving the exact opposite direction in response to the threat environment. I think the other piece about the USA Freedom Act that I think is interesting and challenging for privacy advocates, I think this is part of why I think EFF supported the bill, but ultimately, I think thinks it's favorable, but I think there are reasons to think there are problems with the USA Freedom Act, and one of the reasons is what it does is it actually entrenches the notion that the government can and should be collecting some amount of metadata and looking at it, and it puts in place a procedure for the government to repeatedly go back to providers and obtain the data. This all assumes the data is going to be there with the providers, which one of the key flaws from a government's perspective in the USA Freedom Act is it doesn't require the providers to keep the data. And so whereas before the government would go to the providers and say, okay, now every day or every week or every month, you've got to provide us the last 30 days of data, and then the government would hold it for X amount of time, a year or two, whatever the amount of time was. Now it has to go to the carriers when it has an order for a given specific identifier, and there's a real chance the providers simply won't keep it, right? Now there are business reasons to keep records, but a lot of those are largely going away. I mean, when was the last time you checked your phone bill and looked at all the numbers that you dialed, right? It used to be back in the day, I'm old enough to remember we billed for interlata calls, right? So you call long distance, you got an extra bill or a more expensive bill. Phone companies don't really bill that way anymore, by and large. And so as a result, there's less of a business reason to keep the records, and now they'll be under pressure from groups like EFF and the privacy community to not retain the records, so the government can't get them, and so people's privacy is more protected in that sense. And so there's a real question about whether data will be there, but if the data is there, you've now got a completely clear program, whereas before under 215, it was unclear, could the government really get this data? The Second Circuit said, look, it doesn't comply with the statute when you say we're gonna get all the records. Now there's a methodology, and Congress has explicitly endorsed the notion of collection of large amounts of metadata, albeit using specific identifiers, of American cell phone records without the need for a full-blown warrant. And so that's I think from a privacy perspective is one of the challenges that USA Freedom poses for the privacy community.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is somewhat right. I mean, a couple of things. I think the tool on the table is something that we have all gone back on, with the intelligence community, with the government. What we have right now is we had a review group, by the president. We also had an independent executive agency called the Privacy, Civil Liberties, and Oversight Board say that the program wasn't effective. We had also about 3 hearings, 2 in front of the Judiciary Committee, where the metric, admittedly, is how many attacks did this stop? And we've gotten 0. The one thing we do know Section 215 was used for was a material support case where this person, I believe in San Diego, sent over $3,500 to, I think, this terrorist group in the Middle East. And so, I think at least on the effectiveness, we haven't really heard the intelligence community say, well, this is incredibly vital because it has stopped attacks, or it's incredibly vital because we are using it to even social chain people, right? I think that the argument of is it effective or not has been settled, at least by the review groups and by the PCLB. So I think I would if that is going to be an argument, metrics or methodologies, and the intelligence community hasn't shown us that, right? Or have they?
Well, I think that the FBI and the DNI put out a document that showed nine separate acts that they stopped, right? So they've laid out a case. They made a case for it. A lot of people have disagreements on whether that's a legit case or not. But they've laid that out, and they've also said that it stopped attacks in dozens of countries around the world, not just the U.S. And look, the thing to remember about this type of collection, metadata collection, is this is not going to be a silver bullet. Metadata is never going to tell you this person's going from point A to point B and going to conduct an attack. That's just not its use. It's confirmatory. It's helpful. It helps you identify what people are communicating with whom. It helps you identify a network. The link analysis, right, that we now can talk about and that's done is a key part of that. But it's never going to be a silver bullet. It's never going to be that stops a terrorist attack. but it's intelligence collection. Intelligence collection is about taking dozens of pieces of information, putting them together, and seeing if you can figure out what's happening, right? The 9/11 Commission report said, look, part of the problem was we didn't have all the puzzle pieces and we didn't connect them up well. We didn't share information. We didn't work as a collective government to know what everybody else knew and put it together to put the pieces together. And so, metadata is one small piece of that, and it's never going to be the case that somebody's going to say, okay, look, here, this 215 program, stop this terrorist attack. Now, that being said, the government has, so the Colorado case, right,
Yeah.
with the Najibul Azazi traveling from Colorado to New York, the subway attack, in that case, the 215 program was used, again, as confirmatory evidence. They already had a thought that Zazi was involved, and it confirmed his connections with the phone calls he was making to other members of his network. And so that confirmed that, but it wasn't cylindrical.
Well, I think, so there are two things that Jamil touched on. One is the interpretation of the 9/11 Commission report, right? I think that it's not that the intelligence community didn't have tools, it's that the intelligence community failed to put them together, right? The information was there, the information wasn't shared. The FISA wall was blamed for a lot of that. But I think, at least what Jamil is bringing out is the fact that when we read the 9/11 Commission report, we think it says that the information was there. It was not about a lack of tools, right? It was not about the inability to collect all of our calling records to try and chain them against a prospective attack. It was that CIA did have some information on the plotters in Yemen. FBI did have some information on domestic people taking kind of these pilot classes and sketchiness around that. So I think that, that's one thing. I'd also just step back on the efficiency, because I think something that is going to be very important is getting methodology and metrics. It's something that we've been pushing for, because right now everything is behind closed doors and classified, and the American public doesn't know. The American public doesn't know, how effective these programs are. When I see a mass collection of Americans' domestic calling records, and then, two independent commissions say this actually isn't very useful to solving terrorist attacks, it leaves a huge question into, well, why are we doing this? And where's the cost, right? There's a huge privacy cost in having the NSA or any intelligence community know that, I called my dad about the Yankees last night. And I don't think we saw that cost benefit analysis at all. I think it came far too late. And it's pretty egregious, right? It's an egregious collection for at least an outcome that is minimal. On revoking citizenship, Snowden's passport was taken away. So, I mean, so
look, if Ed Snowden wants to come back to the United States, hallelujah, we'll welcome him back. We'll try him in federal court. We'll see how it goes, right? I mean, the U.S. government would love to have Edward Snowden come back to the United States and stand and
they would
make him stand in court.
We'll see about that. But on the point of, I think it's a valid point.
I mean, he's hiding out in Moscow right now. I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, come on.
I think it's a valid point that there are other advancements in countries on the other side of surveillance, right? That we've seen in France and we've seen in Britain these intelligence laws that are actually expanding powers, whereas in the U.S. we actually have the USA Freedom Act. Yeah. But just on the note of what the U.S. is and is not doing on citizenship and things like that. On the entrenching the metadata program, I think that's a good point. I think a question that we all ask is, would a different program exist, right? You had the Second Circuit essentially say that this falls outside of the statute. They didn't touch the constitutional issues, right? They focus purely on if the statute does or does not allow it. And I think the question, I always ask myself is, would there have been another similar program? And does that mean that we do need to reform the law? Does that mean that we did need to introduce this idea where the government has to pick a specific selection term? And is it sufficiently narrow, right? We try to ensure that it is sufficiently narrow by including negative clauses, these things in bills that describe what it cannot be, as well as describing narrow categories, right, of what it could be. So, that's how we try to attack that problem. And on the issue of the data won't be there, I think that's up in the air, right? So the United States doesn't have a formal data mandate, right? We don't have a formal data mandate. There are regulations that mandate the keeping of calling records for 18 months for landline phones.
Long distance,
for
landline records. I mean,
Yeah, for landline phones. So we have that there.
Who still has a landline, by the way? Right? I mean, right? Very few people have landlines.
No, my parents have landlines still.
My parents do. And no call waiting, which is ridiculous. Like, I get a busy signal. Are you kidding me?
So I think the question of if the data will be there is a big question. I think the relationships, what we've seen from the documents and what I think the everyday American views when they see the relationship between a lot of these large corporations and the government is that I think it will be pretty rare if the corporation just completely, goes to a zero-knowledge setup, right? I think that that will be rare, and what it does is it favors the court order process, right? It favors legal process, and I think that is what we're searching for and what we need in any of this, right? If you're going to have any collection, it's got to be under a very strict legal process, a constitutional legal process.
I mean, look, a healthy skepticism of government surveillance is something we should all have, right? And we all probably do have. I mean, it's the way our country began. The Fourth Amendment is a core protection against government intrusion into your private life, and so it's important to be skeptical of government surveillance. It's important to question these programs and ask why they're being done. Is the cost worth the benefit you get? And and look, your mileage may vary. And as you point out, a couple of government panels have determined that the trade-off wasn't worth it. Of course, the government itself did defend the program and said it was worth it. And I would note that the Obama administration continued after the Snowden revelations, didn't stop the program. Right up till the minute that the USA Freedom Act was passed, they continued the program, well, maybe 24 hours before they slowed it down, right? And then the minute that the USA Freedom Act passed, they restarted the program. And so, clearly the government, right, and this administration, which obviously, forget what you think about the Bush administration, right, where I worked, this administration, which purports to be more privacy protective and the like, believes there's some value, right? Even though their own panels question value. And so, it's important to be skeptical. It's important to try and find a path forward on how you protect privacy consistent with the need of the government and the need you want to have your government protect your security, right? It's an important part. I mean, to the extent you believe the government should have limited powers, that's probably the one power you want them to have, which is to protect your own security, right? That's the one core thing you expect the federal government to do for you. And so the question of where that trade-off, I think, is a key one. And if nothing else, there has been a benefit to this debate, right? And the cost-benefit debate in Congress, right? It resulted in the passage of legislation that ultimately doesn't get rid of the program completely, which I think would have been the preference of a lot of activists, right? But it enshrines the program in a much more limited, scope-down way.
Yeah, well, I'd push back on that and say it does get rid of the bulk collection programs, right? It gets rid of the programs where the government does not have a particular name, does not have a particular, item, person, thing. Right. So, I think that it was not the ultimate goal for that legislation. I think that was one of those goals. I think there was, right, the passing of that bill essentially acknowledges, both on the government end, because you had different government entities say different things, but you did have the president support the bill. You had the DNI support, the Director of National Intelligence support the bill, as well as the NSA chief. And I think that
begrudgingly.
I think they wrote a lovely letter that supported the bill.
Noted the potential problems with and the challenges it might pose national security.
But did say it would continue necessary operations and that it would not contribute or harm national security. And so I think that's one of the questions of, it does end these programs, right? And I have no doubt that there probably were very similar programs. We have reports from Charlie Savage at the New York Times saying that there was potentially a similar program of financial records. So I think that it does get rid of those programs, these bulk collection programs. And the debate is, the true debate, and I think what we're both touching on is how narrow is specific selection term? Like how narrow is the collection? And I think that for a lot of people who follow, where the individual privacy organizations were, right, there was a split on USA Freedom Act where you had some privacy organizations support the bill and some privacy organizations not support the bill, and a lot of it hinged on how you interpreted specific selection term and how narrow of the records do you think the government could get with it. And that is it's a key term in the bill, and we will see how the FISA court interprets it and how it develops.
So look, I think we should take questions.
Yeah.
And by the way, so we're happy to talk about any aspect of government surveillance. We don't need to limit it to 215 metadata program. We're happy to talk about content surveillance, 702, collections outside the United States. So if people want to ask questions, we'd love to take them, and we can continue to go back and forth, but how about we fight in front of you guys? All right, questions. Government surveillance, yeah. Maybe you want to come up to the microphone over here?
Yeah, I think that's best. We can repeat the questions too if it's too loud.
Couple of questions actually. One, about the surveillance of calls, telephone records. Is the law clearly states like a traditional cell phone calls from these fixed line providers, or does it also apply, or is there any ambiguity around calls made using non-traditional, like voice or IP systems?
Yes, so I think the law, I think one of the arguments the government made for why they were supportive of the law was that it in some ways expanded what they believe they could get, because it expanded to all forms of communication beyond sort of what the 215 program had been traditionally used for. And so I think the government is looking to get more under the new USA Freedom Program than they did under the 215 program.
That I don't think. That's an interesting question. I don't think so. When it comes to call records are defined. So the definition of call records is defined quite narrowly. The definition of call records, it has to be either a person, a place, or it has to be a person, an individual, actually an individual, excuse me, not a person, because obviously the whole corporate people are persons thing.
It can't be an entity.
So yeah, it cannot be an entity. It has to be an individual person. It has to be an individual. So the call records, for call records, it's quite narrow. I think it's the other tangible records. Yeah, like IP. So it depends. The answer is it depends on the term that they're using, right? They can use a temporarily assigned network address, but if they're collecting too much, the court isn't supposed to allow it. Also, that question, if it does come up, should be public. I think that's a question that hits spot on how you interpret the terms that are going to be used and how the government is interpreting the terms. So your question, I think, speaks exactly to the transparency requirements in the bill. We should, if there is an order using an IP address or using a temporary network address, and it's quite broad, or it's a new application, or significant in any way, we will know.
But to be clear, under the 215 program that the government we learned about, the government was collecting phone records. Now under USA Freedom, they will have the law does permit a broader scope, and it goes beyond call records, right?
Well, it always went. Yeah, I would say though it always went beyond call records, right? You had in the statute.
Oh, the statute, right? The statute subsumes all tangible things, right? But the way they were using it in this program,
yes,
right?
yes.
So we'll see.
Yeah. So. Yeah, if they expand it to say more like a communication, then it gets into totally different, much broader spectrum of data, because communication can be anything.
Right. And remember again, we're talking about just the
metadata.
fact, just metadata, just the fact of the communication, not the content, right?
Not the content.
The content comes under separate authorities.
My next question is about the actual content. So, how does the existing law or that specific Freedom Act applies to the internet traffic or the internet patterns? Does any of that apply, or is it too broad, or do we have any clarity on that?
So,
we will have very different interpretations. You can go first.
Yeah, so I think, look, historically, the FISA law, right, defined communication by the type of technology used and where the people were located. And so FISA is what generally applies to the surveillance of Americans' communications today even. There's the FISA Amendments Act, which deals with surveillance of foreigners who are located outside the United States. And there the collection is much broader and more widely authorized. Now in that collection, you will get a collection of American communications with those foreigners overseas who are targeted, and you'll get the content of those communications. But for an American, no matter where they're located in the world, whether in the United States or outside the United States, you have to go get a court order based on probable cause to believe, in the foreign intelligence context, to believe that they're a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power, essentially a spy or a terrorist, or that you have a criminal court order, you believe you have reasonable probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. So you have essentially what amounts to a Fourth Amendment warrant or a very similar analog to
warrant light. I call it
warrant light,
because it's not
in the foreign intelligence context.
Yeah, in the foreign intelligence context, right? The item that Jamil hops over is Section 702 in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Amendments Act. And this is, as I said, we're going to have very different interpretations of it, because 702, EFF is dealing with, it has litigated against the NSA on Section 702. It is intended to target foreigners, and it is intended for foreign collection, but what we're seeing and what was released actually by the FISA court is that there is a tremendous amount of Americans' content being sucked in on those searches and by those searches, and that we think that there are certainly constitutional protections that should be in play, that there should be a higher legal standard for that statute, because of the fact that we hear the government often say that we don't target Americans. We hear the government say that This is just on foreign collection.
Well, it's illegal. The law actually
terrorists.
bars targeting of Americans under that law.
But the law also allows for a tremendous amount of incidental collection.
But that's always true. Every kind of surveillance, right? So you get a traditional warrant, right, from a court. I tap your phone, right? I have probable cause to believe you're a criminal, right? I'm going to get your communications with everybody else, right? I mean, you guys have all seen it. We talked about this last year, but you've all seen in casino, right, where we're in Vegas, so we're talking about casino, where the wives get on the phone, they're talking about, whatever, just regular business, so the FBI drops off the line, and then the guys get on the phone and they're having their talk about the mafia business. Look, the government is always playing this game of, unintentionally collecting information that isn't relevant to the thing. And so in the case of Americans, we do the same thing in the foreign intelligence context. We minimize the data. Now, we don't do it the same way that we do in the criminal context. We don't turn the wiretap on or off. What we do is we redact out Americans' information when it's collected. If it's not foreign intelligence, you don't keep it. You only you can keep it if it's foreign intelligence information, and you can only unredact the information if it's relevant to understand that foreign intelligence information. So there are protections, but it's a different kind of minimization.
The thing is, it's a very different kind of minimization, right? In the casino example, you had a warrant that was specific, detailed who you're spying on, what you aim to get, as well as being reviewed by a judge, right? When it comes to Section 702, what we see is certifications that judges don't see and are sent over to internet service providers.
Well, they see the sort of broad category, right? We're targeting terrorists overseas.
What the judge sees is the targeting procedures, which have been disclosed. So those have actually been disclosed by the government. So we can all kind of talk about that. And those are these very broad categories that are submitted to the government, that are submitted to the FISA court. The real issue is the certification process, where the content the fact that when you send off one of these certifications, you're going to have a tremendous the aperture of collection, right, in the casino example is going to be much smaller because you said exactly who you're going to search for, what you're searching for, what you want to get, what you aim to get, and where you're going to even search. Whereas with 702, we don't have many of those standards. We have a broad category. We have we think we're going to, the significant purpose, right? We think we will get this, but beyond that, we don't really have a neutral and detached magistrate looking at the exact certification and the exact target.
Per target, that's right.
So I think that's huge. The foreign intelligence one, I don't know. So part of my job is reading a lot of these documents, right, and the policies and procedures of the government. Foreign intelligence defined quite broadly. In the procedures that Jamil is talking about, this, when you do collect too much, you're supposed to redact or you're supposed to delete in some instances. And I pointed to this last year, right? There are two examples that I love pointing to. One is it allows for the procedures allow for the retention of American communications for a technical database reason. And the way technical database is defined is essentially like any maintenance or ability to keep the data, right? It's like
the government doesn't use it that way.
It's an incredibly broad definition. The other one is encryption, right? Anything that is encrypted. There's no analysis. There's an assumption essentially that if you're using encryption, there's something sketchy going.
No. I think the reason why that is, it just takes, if you think there might be communication there you need to get to, but it's going to take you time, right? If you're using brute force or whatever methodology you're using, it's not instantaneous.
But the time is forever. So the encryption clause allows for forever. There's no time limit on when you can and cannot delete it. I mean, I think if you were able to show that it wasn't an American's encrypted communications, I think you might have an argument there.
Yeah.
But sorry, see, we could do this for forever.
My question is, it's the Freedom Act, right? With the Freedom Act, we saw a lot of outcry from Congress and things like that about telecommunication records being stored. But when the Snowden leak happened, there was a lot of other, even more privacy, I guess you could call them violations. And I'm just wondering why we haven't heard outcry on that from lawmakers. It's all about phone records. And my second question is, working in security, I see the value of mass collection of data and then trying to draw intelligence from it. Just wondering each of your individual philosophies on intelligence gathering. I can definitely see some value in pulling intelligence from surveillance, but at a certain point, you know, like, I don't want the government looking at me through my cell phone camera or something like that. So, just thoughts there.
Yeah, sure. On the, you don't mind if I go?
No, please.
On the first one, my answer, I've gotten that question a couple times. My answer is that I think there are two answers. One is that Congress is following the leaks. So you had Section 215 come out. Congress was outraged. It took them 2 years to figure out it took them 2 years to learn about it, right? Because some of the members were saying they didn't even know about it. And then also figure out what to do about it. I think what we're seeing is Congress trail behind the leaks, right? So after the Verizon leak, you had a disclosure discussing Section 702 and what we've been talking about. And what we're seeing, or at least what I'm seeing at EFF when I talk to members and when I talk to their staff, is that they have been in an education phase, right? Probably for the past at least 6 or 7 months, trying to get a grasp on what is Section 702 and how incredibly invasive, right, that it potentially is. But that Congress is starting to look at Section 702, and that, you know, people are certainly getting geared up and trying to figure out what is going to happen when that law expires in 2017. The other thing, the second answer, and the second point I'd talk about is on the encryption, on some of the back doors. I mean, you have seen the House focus a lot more on it. I don't think I've seen the Senate. You know, when I try to remember, I don't think I've seen the Senate really look too much into those issues. Maybe there are a couple of hearings, but in the House, what we've seen are bills being presented. We saw actually 2 amendments get attached to the House appropriations bills, essentially very vocally saying you should not have backdoors in technology products and things like that. So, you know, I think that it's there in the House. Do you want to answer that?
No.
So jumping into it's another great question, that second question. You know, I think the core issue, if I were to really distill the core issue and the core problem, it's that after September 11th, we saw a shift, right? And that shift was from targeted surveillance, particular surveillance, a much more narrow, smaller aperture, morph into we need to collect it all, right? We need to make sure that we have so much information that we can run metrics on it, that we can figure out who is talking to who, all for a foreign intelligence purpose, but we know that that definition is quite broad. So, you know, I think that that is the huge shift. And, you know, my theory on it is that I think we've gone, you know, far too wide, right? What we've seen from the disclosures, what we've seen from a lot of the court orders is just a massive amount of communications and data, and particularly of American communications, right? You know, I'm gonna focus on Americans' data solely because there are very strong arguments when the Constitution kicks in on that, right? I think it is admittedly harder to talk about foreigners. I think there are certain international law principles that the U.S., you know, probably should follow, but has not signed on to. But I think that is how I would distill what has happened, and what we need to do is, you know. What Snowden did is at least he catalyzed a national conversation on some of these things. He didn't catalyze the conversation on all of these things, but at least we're talking about them. You know, at least the polls show that Americans now know what the third-party doctrine is, right? You know, people are understanding what data they give over and how that's implicated with government surveillance as well as corporate surveillance, right? With companies are also collecting a huge amount of data on us. So I think that, you know, is my answer to that. It's that we should find a way, and we can find a way, because there is a way to cramp down and to narrow back the ability to search or the ability to collect all this information. We should have the confidence to find a particular person. We should have the confidence to make sure that we don't have to suck everything up on a fiber optic cable, that we have covert agents doing work to make sure that we don't have to, that we have very narrowly targeted you know, potentially computer exfiltration stuff, or we have narrowly targeted programs and activities instead of this just massive on the wire.
Did you have a question over there? Sorry.
We can't see us.
Yeah, so I was actually just curious when or if you think there will actually be an actual review through the courts of the constitutionality of these programs.
So you know, the 215 program was reviewed by the Second Circuit, and they determined that it didn't meet the statutory requirement. It didn't address the constitutional issue. There's litigation already ongoing about cell phone locational data. We were just talking about that earlier today when we were preparing for this. Look, the courts have considered a lot of these issues. We actually litigated the 702 program with Yahoo in the FISA court in classified litigation that was ultimately declassified in 2009. 2008, we declassified the fact of litigation. The name of the provider was declassified after the Snowden leaks. And we litigated that both in the FISA court itself as well as in the FISA court of review in the second ever case heard before that court. In both cases, the government won that argument that the collection was reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. Even this broad, untargeted collection that Mark is so concerned about that dramatically sweeps up all his American communications, the court ultimately determined it was reasonable. Now, it didn't go to the Supreme Court.
It did not. It was also 3 judges.
What's that? It was 3? That's right.
3 judges.
That's right, 3 judges. But, of course, Yahoo could have sought en banc review by the FISA court review. They didn't do that. Well, sorry, there's no en banc review. It's only a 3-judge panel. You're right. But they could have sought Supreme Court review and chose not to, having lost, twice in pretty clear opinions. But, there's a very real possibility that could happen, and I think we'll see what happens. But, the courts have generally given the government fairly broad leeway when it comes to national security surveillance, particularly when Congress endorses it, right? And so Congress authorizes it, whether it's in the USA Freedom Act in a more limited form or in a broader form under 702. The court tends to give pretty broad leeway to intelligence collection.
Yeah. 2 questions, actually. So the first one is that it seems like these Western countries that you mentioned, France, UK, United States, Australia, are passing these sweeping domestic surveillance laws kind of because terrorism. Realistically, do you ever see a point where a Western administration would say, you know what, terrorism isn't actually that much of a threat anymore, we can sunset these provisions? The first part. And the second part related is, it seems like I'm hearing that the metric being used to measure these or kind of weigh these programs is, well, if we can stop one terrorist attack, we should do it. And so almost, all the cost is being weighed against, could it stop a terrorist attack, or can we prevent a terrorist attack? And I think, Jamil, you even said that, the metadata programs wouldn't necessarily stop an attack, but they're helpful. So, wouldn't it be helpful if every American wore a camera and a microphone all the time? And if that's the metric, like if we can stop one terrorist attack, then why wouldn't that be reasonable as well?
Yeah, and that's exactly why you kind of have to step back from the efficacy model, right? Because if it was efficacious to just tap all of our phones, the government would probably try and make an argument like that. On the first one, can there be a sunset? So oddly enough, the Patriot Act did sunset for about 24 hours because Congress couldn't get its act together. And so it did expire for a little bit, and then it was rebooted. So I think that there can be a sunset. I think that what you point to is an issue, maybe the issue of our time, right? If you look at the number of prosecutions for terrorist-related charges by the DOJ, it's in the annual report, it's always something like less than 1%, right? The DOJ is generally charging almost a majority of narcotics and drug trafficking cases. So I think there's just something, about, how we respond to a terrorist threat, right? We have this, lone wolf idea that's going. There's a provision in the Patriot Act called the lone wolf provision that has never been used. I think that my answer is yes. I think that there is going to be a time and there is going to be a reevaluation of all those laws. I think you saw that with the USA Freedom Act and with what the Patriot Act ostensibly was being used for and to collect. So I think the answer is yes, and I think we're in that period of reevaluation, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and as Mark points out, that a number of these laws already have sunsets built in. The USA Patriot Act, that passed right after 9/11, had sunsets built into it. Some of those things were made permanent. Some of them are still up, and part of this, the 702 law has its own sunset, and so every few years, Congress comes back to it and decides we're going to revisit it. In fact, what triggered really the 215 revisiting, besides the sort of the leaks that came out and the like, were the fact that it was expiring. It was going to go away completely, and so Congress needed to figure out a path forward. And so there are sunsets built into some of these laws that do help with that. And there's, of course, there's the ongoing question of when does the war on terror, if ever, end, right? Is it ever going to come to an end? The president has made clear, President Obama has made clear that it's his view that it can and should come to an end, and it should probably come to an end soon. A couple of years ago, he said that he thinks we're coming towards the end of that effort, and it may be time to revise or repeal the underlying authorization for the use of military force. Now, of course, things have changed since then. We've got ISIS. And that entire conflict, this administration is now in an actual shooting war, albeit a limited one, with ISIS. And so, it's hard to know when that terrorist threat goes away enough that the government would be willing to give up some of its powers, or that Congress decides it's time to take those powers away. But of course, the risk is high, right? And it's easy today for us to think about and to forget about how catastrophic and how deeply we all felt the 9/11 attacks, right? On the day those planes flew those buildings, and those buildings came down, I mean, the country was in complete shock. 3,000 plus people lost their lives that day. It's hard to remember that now, 13 years removed from that. I think we'll just see. But I think Mark is right that we're going through that process now. As we get further away from those catastrophic type attacks, I think it is easier for people to think about how you might limit collection, how you might take steps to do that. Of course, the challenge is, if you don't put in place the right laws now, right, you run the risk that you legislate in a time of crisis. I bet most people in this audience probably don't think the USA Patriot Act is a good idea. That came because of the crisis, right? So as we're talking about things like going dark and encryption, I think it's important that we come together now before there's a terrorist attack or some sort of real problem where you're going to legislate against a very tough background and get really bad laws. And so if you're looking to protect privacy, the time to act is now rather than waiting for the catastrophic event.
In the debate about this topic, and even here today, there's a lot of throwing around terms of like national security threat or terrorism, and the typical examples of ISIS or Al Qaeda, gets brought to mind, but really, at least I think, this is being used much more broadly against peace activists, animal rights activists with just a camera. An Occupy Wall Street person, a whistleblower. And the debate is so often about who, protecting against these real terrorist threats versus, protecting privacy, and very little about what is a legitimate terrorism threat and whether that's being overstepped. And, we have a long history of overstepping that. And, why doesn't that get more scrutiny? And is the FISA court in this new scheme going to be considering that as well?
So look, I think that you make a very good point, which is that this is actually what motivated the original FISA law, right? Was these disclosures that the U.S. government was surveilling domestic activists, Martin Luther King Jr., right? Jane Fonda, right? That's what prompted these laws to restrict government surveillance back in the 1970s. And so one thing that's notable about the Snowden disclosures is we haven't seen evidence of that in the Snowden disclosures, right? That there's broad surveillance of domestic political opposition or the like, or the Nixon type activities in the current collection programs. We haven't seen that. Now, doesn't mean it's not happening, right? From what I've seen inside the government, I don't see that happening, but there's certainly a possibility. The question you raised, though, is a good one, which is how broadly do you define these terms, terrorism, these terms of national security, and how they're being used, at least in the current way that what we've seen in the orders that have been disclosed by the FISA court. What the government's doing under 702 is going after foreigners overseas who present a foreign intelligence threat, right, spies and terrorists and the like, not domestic peace activists. And in fact, the 702 law, as we've been talking about a little bit, requires you to go get a federal court order, whether from a FISA court or from a criminal court, to surveil any Americans for any purpose. And so you'd have to find a belief that a crime is being committed. Now, there are domestic terrorism crimes. And it's the question of, well, are these animal rights activists, are they engaged in domestic terrorism? Remember back in the 80s, right? We remember the sort of the attacks on the Colorado ski resorts and the like that some activists engaged in. So is that terrorism? It seems not, but it's certainly a criminal act. And so that's a hard question.
Yeah, my response to that is we've seen a few things. We've seen that a law firm, right, one of the law firms, I forget which one, the former NSA GC is now working for them, but they were spied upon by these programs. I don't know if it was Section 702, but there was an exclusive report on how the programs were being used to spy on a law firm engaged in trade negotiations on a given topic. The second thing is we've seen profiles of
an American. So an American law firm was targeted for surveillance.
Yeah, but they didn't. It was unclear as if it was 702. Yeah, you should check it out. I can pull up Google right now. I believe it was like Williams Collinet. Williams Connolly. It was there, so that's been reported on. The second one we have had profiles of Arab American activists being spied on. Again, the details in the article, it's unclear if it's Section 702 or if there were in fact FISA 1978, original FISA warrants out for them.
Yeah, so again, look, it's illegal, it's against the law explicitly to surveil Americans under the 702 program, no matter where they are in the world. It is illegal. So if the government's doing that, it's unlawful. It's unlawful under the statute that we passed in 2009, 2007, 2008. Number two, if there is a FISA court order just for surveillance of these Americans, right? That's what's required. That's what the law requires. It requires you to go to court, show probable cause, right? Or in the case that the person's a foreign intelligence target or a foreign power agent of a foreign power. That's the law. That's the law Congress passed. Just like you would have to go in a criminal case to go to the court and get surveillance of an American and get a court order to surveil that person. So that's the constitutional standard. It's not that you can't surveil Americans, it's that you have to get a warrant.
But what we've seen is that with the 702, the incidental collection, people have been searched for, right, there are search terms in the collection that you get from Section 702, even if you were targeting the foreigners, that the DNI and the NSA were searching the pile of communications for U.S. identifiers, right? This is all incidental.
So this is a good point, yeah. So if you collect foreigners, if you're collecting as a foreigner, right, and you want to see if an American's communicating with them, why would you take that off the table? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, you're not taking it off the table, but there should certainly be a higher legal standard. Right now, an analyst just looks at it.
Why would there be higher? If the collection was lawful, the collection was against somebody who did not have any Fourth Amendment rights, have no constitutional rights, right, and you're collecting against a foreigner located outside the United States, they have no rights under our Constitution, why should you not be able to search that for anything? You've lawfully picked the data. It's like saying, oh, I've got this file of information, but I'm not going to go look through it because I'm going to put another process on top of it.
You can look through it as long as you get legal process, right? And not the legal process is not 702. The legal process when you're looking at or searching for U.S. identifiers should be right a Fourth Amendment process.
But why? You're not looking at Americans' data. No, you're not. Oh, and we're out of time. But we will stick. We'll tell you what. If people have more questions, we'll stick around outside. Feel free to come up, talk to us. We'd love to chat more. Thank you, guys.